In this video, I'm going to show you how to create a section and to annotate a plan drawing to coordinate with the section sheet. So once again, we're looking at a floor plan here, and the floor plan, if you have not noticed already, is really what we use for all of the annotations for the drawing set so that it doesn't crowd up the design plan, which is always going to have additional content on it. But what I want you to do now is we're going to focus on two sections, which are a little bit different than elevations. We're going to begin by discussing how to notate them on a plan view, and then how to create a sheet with sections on it, where we will, of course, look at the sheet layout and the annotations, and then we'll look at individual section drawings. So to start off, we're going to look at how to show a section on a floor plan view. And you can see here, we've created a section tag that runs across the full width of this space. And you can see it right here. And what this shows is, it's if you dropped a blade and sliced straight down into the building and looked in the direction of this arrow, you would be able to see what is shown on drawing 1 on page A103. But before we move over to that sheet, what I want you to notice is that this tag is not overlapping those dimension lines. And when we created this floor plan earlier, those dimension lines were a little bit shorter, and now you know why. You can see there's also this little post-shaded flag at the end, and that shows the end of the tag where this is the start of the tag. Now, sometimes if the section line overlaps too much stuff and it becomes hard to differentiate where, just for whatever reason, it becomes hard to understand, you can break your section tag here and here and get rid of the line in the center, and that will clean things up a little bit. And you'll see that later on in, when you learn Revit. But for right now, this is a very simple, straightforward section tag. Now, if you overlay this with your design plan, you'll see that this section tag is running right up against the sinks in the bathroom here, and if it's not touching, it's very close to touching the wall, the curved wall that's got the seating arrangement here. Now, we never really want to slice through things like, partial walls, or we don't really want to reveal stuff that's like cut through structure in this way without showing it, and you'll see what I mean in a second. But for right now, if it comes and skims right up against your furniture arrangement, don't worry about that. We're not going to show what it looks like if you were cut through that little piece of wall. We're just going to show sort of like what you would see if you took just a half a step forward. There's other ways of drawing a section tag so that it might continue through here, create a vertical line and move up, and it can be a little bit of a zigzag, but that can get a little bit confusing. So for right now, we just want to keep the section tag straight with the idea that we're cutting through and seeing everything that we would see if we looked that way. So now that we understand a little bit more about this section tag, we're going to take a look over to an actual section drawing. So here we are on our section sheet, and you can see it's A103 with the section label here. And just like all of the other sheets, you still see the title bar along the side. You can see that I have planned my drawings and placed them so that margins are as equal best I can, and that there's a sense of organization to the overall sheet. You can see that the drawing numbers align with each other, as well as with the leftmost edge of the drawing itself, and extend the line for the label extends to the rightmost edge of the drawing. A couple of things as you're looking at this sheet, there's 3 parts or 3 drawings on this. We have the interior section, which we just discussed and that we'll talk about in more detail, and that's up here. And then you've got 2 interior partition sections. Now, an interior partition is the same thing as an interior wall. But throughout the drawing project, any drawing project, there's going to be different wall types. And so there's going to be, fire rated walls and, non-fire rated walls and, very thick walls that have structure and plumbing walls and all kinds of different walls, masonry walls, all different kinds of walls. And you have to show all of these different wall types, and they may be provided to you by the architect. But here I'm showing these on our drawings because these are two wall types that you as an interior designer need to be aware of. And you may be asking yourself, why isn't there a section tag on the floor plan to show where these wall sections are being taken out of? And it's really because almost all of the interior walls in our project are of these types. So we wouldn't really want to crowd the drawing with a bunch of different section tags. We just want to know that, these are the two main wall types that we have. In the real world, in a real drawing set, you would tag all of the different walls, and you would have a schedule, which we'll look at a little bit later, of all the different wall types and the thickness and how they're constructed. But for our very simplistic drawing set, these are just typical wall sections. And so we're going to talk about what that means in just a moment. So now that we understand what's being shown on this page and that we are still maintaining a consistent layout and just good graphic design on the page itself, I also want to draw your attention to the bottom two drawings of the wall sections. You can see here again, we've got drawing on the left, notes on the right, and very important placement and careful deliberate placement of the arrows and notes. You may also be wondering why there's not a bunch of notes or any other labels on this interior section at the top, the drawing number 1. And that's because first, we don't have room, and secondly, because we're not going to get into that level of detail with this drawing. What I really wanted to show here was something large enough that you would be able to see a good amount of detail and reflect what's on the floor plan. In the real world, your drawing would be much more detailed than this and would show more information, but it would also be on a sheet that's maybe 24 by 36 or 36 by 42. So we're just limited as far as our detail level and how much information we can convey, both because of the scope of the class and the amount of detail that we can get into and the sheet size. So with that said, let's go ahead and zoom in a little bit more on the particular drawings on this sheet. Let's begin with this longitudinal section, and a longitudinal section is one way of talking about sort of the long cut through a space. If I would have ran my section cut instead of horizontally, vertically on my floor plan and looked either to the left or to the right, that would have been considered a transverse section. So it's a little bit shorter and it doesn't really show the full space. The other thing I want to tell you about a section is that it's very similar to what you would see in an interior elevation. And in fact, you may create interior elevations, but an interior elevation is simply what a person or a viewer would see standing in one spot and looking in a direction. A section cuts through all the walls and the ceiling and shows what an omnipresent force might see, for lack of a better way of explaining it. We see all the spaces through the walls, beyond the walls, and up into the ceiling and up into the floor. So the difference between an elevation and a section is an elevation shows finished walls that could be perceived by a viewer standing inside. A section shows the same things as an elevation with additional information about the structure. So let's go ahead and look a little bit closer at this structure. So again, if you think back to that elevation cut, it started at the left side and went all the way through the interior and was looking up against the back wall. Now, this section will have more information added to it through a series of assignments. But right now, I want you all to trace over this very basic section that you see here. For example, we'll see on the reflected ceiling plan later that there's going to be a series of pendant lights that run across the front of this bar. There's going to be equipment sitting on the countertop here. There's going to be sconces that are going to be in between each of these windows. There's going to be a texture material on the back wall and on this bar front. In an interior section, you would also see, in addition to what I've shown here, the baseboards, you would also see material finishes as well, but we're not going to see all that right now. This is just the very first time we're looking at a section. So you can see here, these are the two restrooms, and we cut just right in front of that sink. So you can see here, there's the sink, the piping part of the sink, which again is not fully detailed. This is the wall-mounted toilet, and this is the grab bar that you would see on the side of the toilet. There's also another grab bar mounted behind the toilet back here, but you can't see it because it's covered by the sink. As I told you, there's a little baseboard here, which is, we'll find out later, is the same thickness as the wood flooring that's going on the floors. This little object right here, this is a sprinkler coming down. So this is a sprinkler building. And again, all of the ceiling things we're going to get into in a little bit more detail later on when we look at a reflected ceiling plan. But for right now, all you need to know is when we cut through the ceiling, this is an 8-foot ceiling, we see the actual ceiling thickness, so for lack of a better term, the drywall. And then we also are seeing where we would be cutting through the exhaust vent and the supply and return vents here. So that's what this is, and this is back here. There's a recessed can light right here, and like I said, the sprinklers here. So notice we have the exterior wall here, which is very thick. This interior wall here, which is a little bit thinner. Now, when you cut through a wall in a section, it's just pochade in black. So that's this indicates that we're cutting through a space. Now, there's a whole lot of stuff in there that we're not showing here, but there could be, brick cladding and insulation and a vapor barrier and structural support and headers and footers and all sorts of things, but we're not going to show that right now. This wall over here is connected, and you can reference your floor plan for this, but it creates the wall that encloses the bathroom, but it also creates the kitchen wall all the way to this back wall back here. And it's a little bit thicker, you can see, than this wall, and it goes all the way up. It goes up a little bit higher, and that's because it's a fire-rated partition, and I'll talk about that in just a second. But that's a fire-rated partition, so it goes from the slab here all the way up to the structure above, whereas this one only goes partially up. Okay, you can see this is the side view of an exit light, and we'll study all about that a little bit later on in the reflected ceiling plan. You can see we've indicated with just change of plane lines here the countertop with the freezer case right here, and you can see there's electrical outlets on the back wall, which is where we're going to start to plug in some equipment. There's also going to be a drop ceiling here that's over the bar, and an acoustical ceiling tile that's acoustical ceiling tile ceiling that's up a little bit higher. And again, this will make more sense in later sections, but just for right now, take my word for it. So it's a higher ceiling in the main area, and then there's a drop ceiling over the bar, and both of them have sprinklers on them. One's a little bit farther back towards the wall, and one's a little bit closer to us, the viewer. What you're seeing here is the cut through of the acoustical ceiling tile ceiling, and you can see here this is more sections, more cut throughs of the fluorescent light fixtures. Now right here on a section you can't see depth, so it looks like the sprinkler is attached right on top of or just below this fluorescent light, but it's not. There actually one's a little bit closer to the back wall than the other, but we don't see depth in a section like this. We just are looking at this for the relationship of heights. But in any case, we've got sprinklers attached to this acoustical ceiling, acoustical tile ceiling. And you can see the windows here. These aren't the fancy windows that are on the front facade, they're just the basic ones. And then you can see I've got my parallel lines indicating glass. You can see back here, this is the booth where people are going to be sitting at. And if you reference your floor plan, you'll be able to see that. We've got in the booth, we've also got a series of, these are electrical outlets for people to plug in their laptops. And you can see we've got both the seats that are right up against that banquette, and then overlapping that is actually there's a set of little foretop that's kind of floating in front in the main area of the cafe, and that's what you're seeing right here. So there's a lot of chair legs in this. So when you draw it, when you draft this, be sure you start off with your very thinnest line weight pen, and then come back in for change of plane with the thicker line weights for the other elements that you can. But just for these, even though technically they are a change of plane, you won't be able to do it with a 0.3 millimeter. You're going to have to do it with the very, very thin ones. Okay. And you can see here again, this is slicing through the concrete slab. And so you can see there's some stippling here. Also, this line indicates ceiling structure, whatever it is. We are not architects, we are not structural engineers, so we're not going to get into it. But for right now, we know that the structural ceiling is all of this here, from this line to this line, and then this part is roof. But again, we're sort of taking this approach of, you know, the less detail for the things that aren't concerning us right now, the better. We really want to keep our focus right on the interiors. Okay, so that's a basic overview of what you're seeing in this section. Keep in mind, this section is going to make a lot more sense once we see the reflected ceiling plan that goes along with it. So what you see when you lay on the floor and look up, because that will inform sort of what's happening in this section cut in this ceiling stuff here. And then also keep in mind, through the course of your assignments, we will go ahead and detail more information along this back wall to give it some personality. But for now, I would like to move on and discuss the partition sections that you see here. So once again, these are just typical, they're throughout, but I want to differentiate for you between what a 2-hour fire rated partition is and what a typical interior fire rated or a typical interior partition is. So a typical fire rated partition, and that's what you're seeing on the left, this is a 2-hour fire rated partition. And what makes it, well, first, what makes it a 2-hour fire rating is how many layers of drywall is on top. So, but you may be first wondering, what in the world is this thing? This looks nothing like a wall. So let me deconstruct what you're staring at here. If I were to draw a section of a partition, it would be very long. If you take this is a 3/16 inch scale, and it's, you know, an inch and a half tall. If I were to draw this to the level of detail that we really need to see, which in this case is 1.5 inch scale, this whole wall, if I drew it at its full length, it would take up several computer screens stacked one on top of the other. And we don't have room for that. And ultimately, we really don't need to show the entire wall, because if we slice through it, if this wall is, you know, 10 feet tall, we don't need to show 10 feet of all the guts, because it's going to be the same for, like, you know, 8 feet of the 10 feet. It's all going to be the same. So what we use instead is these things called break lines. So imagine that we are looking at this part right here. We're going to blow up this section, this wall section right here. Okay, and that is this. So this break line here and here, they're just like a little S that cuts off the end. And what this break line means is this continues in this direction and it continues in this direction, but we don't want to show it all. So this line right here, this structure right here, is this right here. Okay? And we're basically saying, yeah, it goes all the way this direction and all the way in this direction, but we're going to stop it right here because we don't need to repeat information. Now, this part, this wall right here, this part right here, is that part right there. Okay? This part right here, this is part right here. Okay, it's not exactly the same because this is a typical partition, which means it's just sort of a generic partition, whereas this one is obviously in situ. So there's other stuff going on. There's a couple of ceiling, drop ceiling, false ceilings attached to it. There's no baseboard shown here, but there's baseboards here. So that's a difference between a typical one and like an instance, for lack of a better term. All the guts right here is right here. And we're not showing it. Instead, we're showing this break line. And we're saying, okay, we're going to show all the details we need here. Then we're going to cut it off. And where this is all the same, we're going to get rid of it. That's all happening here. And then we're going to pick it up where it starts to get interesting again. And then, just like this structure down here is this structure down here. Now, the thickness of these structures is not very critical in this particular section because we don't necessarily know. I mean, this slab's going to have all sorts of stuff, not just concrete. It's going to have like metal decking, perhaps, and some other structural supports, screws that, bolt stuff into the concrete slab. This structure here is going to have all sorts of, beams and joists and all sorts of other things that we're not going to concern ourselves with right now. Right now, we're keeping it very simple, but the thickness right now here is sort of arbitrary. So let's talk a little bit more about what we're seeing here. A fire-rated partition is fire-rated for two main reasons. The first is because it goes from slab to slab. What that means is there's it's compartmentalizing a fire. So if there's a fire in here or in here, concrete is fireproof, and whatever this is going to have a fire rating as well. So if a fire starts here, because this wall goes from slab to slab, the fire can't go from this room to this room. So we have fire rated partitions that enclose tenant spaces. So it will separate, if you have a strip mall, it'll separate the nail salon from, the convenience store from the place that sells grills, et cetera, et cetera. So we use it to separate tenant space, and we also use it to separate places where there could be a fire. So as I told you already, back here is the kitchen. And so if there's a fire in the kitchen, or if one of these coffee pots explodes over here, there's a separation between these two spaces. So that's the first thing that makes a partition fire rated. The second thing that makes it a fire rated partition is it's got 2 layers of drywall, and that's what you're seeing here. There's 2 layers. Now, each layer of drywall, which you've probably seen and touched before, each one has a 1-hour fire rating. So all walls are fireproof for at least an hour. It'll take an hour for them to catch on fire and burn. So that gives you an hour to get outside. A fire rated partition has a double layer. So it's 2 hours on each side. So that's what you're seeing here. So far we've got the slab, we've got the double layer of 5/8 gyp drywall. And you can see here there's a section for crown molding if applicable. And we may add crown molding later, but this one is not showing it. But that's where that would go. And you can see there's a little bit of a texture line in our very, very thin line weight for indicating wood. This is also very thin line weight right here. Okay, inside the wall, behind the 2 layers of drywall, there's this insulation And that's how we draw. It's just a squiggly line that runs all the way down. And that's, you know, that pink insulation, or it can be blue-in insulation, but it doesn't have any fire protection rating. It's really just to separate for acoustics or thermal insulation. So if you want to make it insulate a space so it's not transferring noise or it's not transferring heat, that's what we use insulation for. It has no fire rating in this case. And then what you've got here is what they call steel top track, and that's basically just like a metal channel that runs all the way the length of the wall, and that's what gives it some support, but that's also what we start to connect and drill things into. So that's how we drill the drywall in, and you know, it gives us a nice little cavity for the insulation to go in. So you can see we got a break line. Insulation down here as well, same thing. The steel stud runner track here, again, it's just that little channel, and you know, that's what's bolted into the slab, and that's what things start to connect to. The double layer of gyp, and then you can see there's a cut view of the baseboards here again. Okay, and then you can see here, just underneath the baseboards, there's a little gap right here and right here, and then the flooring starts, and that's an expansion gap, and it's got a little fire-proof sealant in it. But that expansion gap is so that as the building breathes and as the temperature changes, the flooring has the ability to expand and contract just a little bit. Because if you don't allow an expansion gap, then the floors, especially, you know, wood floors, will buckle and they'll bump up against the rest of the planks, and it'll look really bad. So there's always a little tiny expansion gap right there. And then the structure below. So that's a 2-hour fire rated partition. This is essentially, you could say it's a 1-hour fire rated partition, but that goes without saying. It's just a typical interior fire partition because, again, they all have a 1-hour fire rating. In this case, it is not fire rated. There's a big gap between the ceiling structure and the like structure of the building, and that's what we're seeing right here. So what you're seeing is this wall starts at the slab, just like down here. It goes up to this ceiling, which is a drop ceiling. Okay, so it's an 8-foot ceiling. And then it goes up just a little bit above that, just to make sure that there's a clean break and some room for other stuff as needed, and that there, you know, nothing's gonna, you know, you've got a little bit of extra space, I guess. And then the structural ceiling is above. Okay, and why do we build it like this? Because it's cheaper, it's easier, it's cheaper. So if a fire were to occur in this bathroom, what's going to happen is it's going to catch on fire. Hopefully the smoke alarms start blaring and the sprinklers pop out and start spraying water. But if not, for whatever reason, the fire is going to go up here, it's going to go over here, and it's going to fill this room with fire and smoke. Okay, so this does not compartmentalize fire, but it's cheaper and it's not really necessary because the likelihood that there's going to be a fire in the bathroom is very small. So that's the big difference structurally between these two. The actual line work, you know, it's the same thing, same break lines, same channel, but here you only have a single layer of gyp. So, or 5/8 gypsum drywall with 1-hour fire rating. I call it just gyp, and that's what a lot of people in the industry call it, is gyp. So, the single layer of gyp on either side is what makes it, again, the 1-hour fire rating. So that's the difference between these two. I put a little bit more detail here so that you would be able to see, because we had a little bit more space to do it, but this is the difference between the two. So again, when you look at this sheet, it gives us information about the sections of the walls, particular walls, typical walls, and then what we're seeing in this structure here as we cut through. Okay. So now that you hopefully have a little bit better of an understanding of how we use drawings
4 sections to show how the parts and the pieces in that three-dimensional puzzle are starting to come together. We are now seeing that this is an additional view that we can show building information about. And again, this is going to get much more detailed, but now at least you know how to show it on a floor plan with a section tag, and you know how to lay out a sheet to show an entire width of an interior space that shows how different rooms come together and the difference between typical interior partitions and fire rated partitions, and how those are used to compartmentalize space and smoke. Okay,